If you've been on your Christian walk for a long time, it is likely that at some point or another you have considered leaving your church. Today we're going to talk about when it is okay to do so. Hello everyone, I am Landon Reynolds and I'm a confirmed American Baptist, and today we're going to be talking about when it's okay to leave your church. This is going to be a part of the series that I've been slowly making my way through over the last 3 episodes, I think. This will be, I believe, the 3rd installment in the series, and then there's going to be one more on Wednesday. But today we're going to be talking about generally some of the situations in which it's okay to leave your church. So we're going to start right where we did yesterday and jump right back into what to do if you disagree with your church. So if you do disagree, if you've gone through all the processes, if you've talked to your ministers, you've heard their arguments, and you're still unconvinced that what they're saying is true, and you're still convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that you are right, well, then there's 2 kinds of separation you can make. The first of these is negative separation, which is disagreeing with the teachings of your church, but still submitting to its authority. So you would still attend services, you'd still participate, you'd still receive the ordinances there, but you would just be in disagreement with the doctrine. So this is ordinarily what you should do. And I would say 99.9% of the time, this is what you should be doing. And the only occasion in which it's okay to go further than this is if you are kicked out of your church. So that brings us to the other kind of separation, positive separation, which is fully separating from and leaving your church. And the only time where this is ever acceptable is if they kick you out and force you to leave. Any other time that this occurs, it would be the sin of schism. If you do have to make a positive separation because you are kicked out, there should be a 2-step process for how to move forward. Number 1, you should see if there's other valid churches in your community. And if there is, even if they're in error, you should go to them. And 99.9% of the time, this should be the end of it. You're kicked out of your last church, so you find another valid church in your community, and you go to that one, and then that's the end of it. If, for some reason, there are no valid churches in your community, then you may start a new church. This possibility is almost non-existent as a good option. There's almost never an occasion where you should be doing this, because this is only ever okay if there's 0 valid churches within driving distance of you that are willing to have you, and 0 valid denominations that are even willing to work with you. So the reality is, if you live in any Western country, or really any country where you're able to watch this, that's really never going to be the case. You're never going to be in that situation. Just to catch us back up to speed, schism is a sin, so splitting from your church is a sin. Leaving your church without being kicked out is a sin, and switching churches. And if you are kicked out, you should go to another church that is valid, and by valid we mean valid apostolic succession, traces its roots back to the apostles. If you want more information on how to determine that, you should probably watch this series as a series, beginning with episode 1, which is titled Why the Church Must Be Institutional, and then watch the whole thing, because we're kind of going into great detail over the course of this series on how to determine that. But basically, valid apostolic succession, no schisms in their history where it was their fault. So if there's another church in your area that has valid apostolic succession and has valid authority and it's a valid church, you should go there if you're kicked out of your last church. And if that is not the case and there is no denominations that are willing to partner with you, then you can start a new church. But that is almost never going to happen. So basically, to sum it up in a bite-sized piece of information that you can use that's going to be applicable to you in your life, if you get kicked out of your church, go to another valid church. That is probably, I can say confidently for everybody watching this video, as far as that is ever going to go for you. Now let's look at another issue. What if your church is part of a valid institution, but it teaches heretical things? Well, it is still a valid church with authority, as we will see in Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 3, and now the word of God. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. Now, the Pharisees were pretty close to apostate, if not fully apostate, and Christ still said to obey them. So a church being in error, even serious error, does not take away their authority. They are still part of the church Christ founded, and you still should obey them. The church is the new Israel. I'm a covenantalist. I believe that the church is the new Israel, and that that God interacts with the church the same way he interacted with Israel. It's more complicated than that, but if you know the covenantalist position, you should know what I mean. So, as such, the church still has authority and legitimacy, regardless of how doctrinally sound it is. If you are unconvinced of this, look at the Old Testament pattern. Think about when Moses went up to get the Ten Commandments, and when he came down, they were worshiping the golden calf. I would say that's falling to heresy. But Moses didn't go start a parallel Israel when the old one became apostate. He rebuked and corrected them, but he stayed in communion with them insofar as he brought them back into correct doctrine. Also, if you want some examples from church history, church tradition, they didn't start a new church in the early centuries when the church almost fell to Arianism. I believe all but a couple dioceses fell to Arianism, but they did not start a parallel church to the Arian church. They stayed in it because they knew it was the church Christ established still, and they reformed the church. And that is what you have to do too, unfortunately. You don't get to just start a new church. That's not how that works. Christ established a church, and you should be in the church Christ established. Unless they kick you out, in which case you would have no choice. That is the one and only exception. So what do you do if your church is heretical? Now we can answer that question more directly. If there are other valid churches in your town, you may go to those instead, if it will be beneficial to your faith. But if there are not other valid churches, unfortunately, you do still have to stay at your church and you should maintain a negative separation, so you should disagree with them doctrinally, probably pretty strongly, if they're heretical. And you may pray and advocate for reform back to orthodoxy, but unfortunately, until you are forced to leave, that is still not an excuse to schism. If this sounds strange or wrong to you, it is probably because we have a different view of the church. So the church, in my view, is the institution Christ founded for the purpose of public worship of him and the proper administration of his ordinances. Good preaching is just a bonus. It is not the main reason you go to church. So if the preaching isn't good, if the leadership is bad, unfortunately you still have to go to that church. Unless they force you to not attend, or they don't allow you to worship God there, or they aren't administering the ordinances, it is still the church. and you should still be loyal to it. If you can still publicly worship in the church, that is still the church Christ founded, you should still publicly worship there, unless they are preventing you from doing so. This loyalty, to be clear, is not loyalty to the corrupt leadership, but to Christ. It's loyalty to the church he gave us and the church that he willed that we be unified with. And since he willed that the church be unified, and since he established the church, and since that was his expectation, we should do everything in our power to ensure that this vision is carried out. And to be clear, most of these situations I laid out here, like where you're being forced out of your church or that your church is heretical, you are probably never going to encounter this situation in America. If you do encounter this situation, the answer is almost always going to be go to another valid church, because in America, you would be hard-pressed to find a place where you would not be in close access to a valid church. So, basically, moral of the story, obey your church. And in the rare occasion where you're forced out, go to another valid church. Or if your church is teaching heretical things, if there's a non-heretical valid church around you, go there. If not, unfortunately, you're just going to have to suck it up and deal with it. Because the main purpose of going to church is to give that time to God in worship and prayer. And you can still do that in the church, regardless of what the leadership believes. Because the church is not the pastor, the church is not the leadership. The church is the invisible body of believers. Well, and it's the visible body of believers. I don't want to slip into evangelical language here, because there definitely is an institutional church, obviously. The institutional church is the institution that Christ gave us. It's the place in which we are to go to worship him. And it doesn't matter what the leadership believes, because the leadership, really, they're not why you go. And if you really think that you can't go to a church where the pastor is not within the bounds of orthodoxy, I think you are off focus and you think that the church is defined by who the pastor is, when that is not the case. I have made videos on that subject. But, yeah. I think that about concludes my thoughts for today. Quick brain check, make sure that I covered everything. Yeah, I think I covered everything. So that about concludes my thoughts on when it's okay to leave your church. If you have an opinion different from mine, feel free to leave a comment below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And if you really want to keep the discussion going on this matter, well, I will have another video on these subjects, but if you want to keep the discussion going on anything I mentioned here or anything I've mentioned in the series up to this point, feel free to join my Discord server. I will leave a link in the description below if you are interested. And if you are enjoying this series, and if you enjoyed this video and you enjoy hearing my opinions on things, feel free to like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss any of the videos I post in the future. I would love to have you. But yeah, I think that about concludes my thoughts on this topic for today. Thank you for joining me. God bless you, and stay faithful.